But don't feel pressed to explain your hair to this 2022, so if they can't live with it, they can go and hug a transformer. Okay, so stages of lock maturation. Like I said initially, one of the first things you're going to notice very quickly, if you're not instant locked, if you're using any of the other methods to lock your hair will shrink, your hair will get frizzy, and then after the initial shrinkage and frizziness, one of the first signs that your hair really is on its way to locking that you're going to notice is what is called the bud. Okay, so your hair goes, each lock strand will go through what is called the budding phase. And what this looks like is, it will look like each of your individual locks is pregnant. So there'll be a part of the lock, and okay, if I come, can you, I don't know if you guys can see this part of my lock. Okay, so this, if you look at this hair strand, you can see that this was where my bud, this was the initial bud. I'm not fully locked in any of my locks. Many of my locks still have loose curly ends, but the initial sign that your locks are progressing to maturation is that bud. It looks like a little pregnant. Each of the locks look like they have a little pregnant belly. Okay, and if you touch the bud, it tends to be firmer or harder than the rest of the lock. Okay, something that people sometimes ask me is, what's the difference between a bud and bunching? And I tell them, oh, you want your hair to bud, you don't want your hair to bunch. Okay, I don't want to talk about bunching now. I'm going to make a separate video about that. But things like bunching, holes, slippage, unraveling, those are all things that would require repair. Those are all things you do not want. They are not necessarily part of the maturation process. But bunching looks very much like budding. The only way to really tell the difference is by touching that area, the swollen area, the part of the lock that is thicker than the rest of the lock. So visually they may look the same, but when you touch a bud, it is firmer or harder than the rest of the lock. When you touch bunching, it is softer or looser than the rest of the lock. Okay, bunching occurs for a variety of reasons. It's not always necessarily the fault of the loctician. It can be, but it isn't always the fault of the loctician. Sometimes bunching just occurs because, especially for people who start off their locks with really long hair, who also start off with twists or a method that is not very stable in structure. Those are the people who tend to experience bunching. But sometimes it can happen even with the more stable structural methods if the loctician, for whatever reason, got distracted, did the rotation wrongly, or maybe they weren't so careful to check after they were done crocheting, and they leave that place relatively soft. When the hair then begins to shrink, the longer hairs, especially if it's someone who started with really long hair, will bulge in that section. It can be fixed, but a lot of locticians would require you to come make a separate appointment in order to fix things like bunching and holes and all that sort of thing. I'm not talking about bunching, okay? I'm talking about budding. Budding is a required phase. Okay, if you touch it, it's harder than the rest of the locks. All right, and what usually happens if your locks are shorter, if you start out with let me say, if you start out with 5 inches or less of hair, then you notice that the bud may form on the ends of your locks. So I always say to clients, resist the urge to pop off. A lot of us, when we're working, when we're reading, when we're lost in thoughts, we tend to pop off the ends of the lock. If you do that, the budding is just going to start all over again, and then you'll be losing length. Okay, I just felt a bud. I don't know if you can, I don't know how clearly you can see that. Okay, I have a bud right at the tip, which is kind of funny because I started off with relatively long hair. Okay, but if you can see that I have a bud at the very tip. If your hair is shorter at the time of your installation, your buds tend to form at the tip of your locks. This isn't, I mean, it doesn't apply to everybody, you know, everybody is different. But the general thing, you know, the general rule is if your hair is longer, the bud tends to form about, let me say, 2/3 of the way up your locks. Okay, but regardless of where your bud forms, try to avoid pulling it off if it's at the end. If it forms midway up your locks, you would notice that it would then tend to spread up and down in both directions. If it forms at the tip, it would tend to spread up. Okay, so your locks will then progressively harden or become firmer, and start to feel, every part of your lock will then start to feel like the tiny little swelling or the tiny little bud feels like. Okay, and the reason why is your locks are freezing. When they freeze, then they're better able to catch onto each other and mesh and tangle, and the tighter and tighter and tighter that meshing occurs, the more compact your locks looks. Eventually, because the whole of that bud is going to spread up and down, right? Even though in the beginning, just like mine, remember I said that my locks are not fully mature. Even though in the beginning there may be parts of it, and then for some people, right, they get multiple buds on one lock. Okay, some people may get one and then to spread up and down. If your hair is longer, you tend to see multiple buds on each lock, which then spread and coalesce and come together. And then by the time the meshing, so the way the maturation happens is you get the bud. Within that bud, there's a lot of meshing occurring. It's becoming more and more and more compact. At some point, it loosens up again, you know, only to, you know, come back compact again. And this is where washing, or the frequency of washing, becomes very important. Because what happens every time you wash your hair, right? When the water goes on, it weighs your hair down, right? So it stretches. And then as your hair dries, it shrinks. You wash again, it stretches. Your hair dries, it shrinks. Remember, you're not detangling. And so what happens every single time you wash your hair, it creates this stretching and shrinking, which causes further and further and further and further tangling. So instead of seeing water as your enemy, I want you to think of water and washing as your friend. The more frequently you wash your hair, the more tangled your hair becomes because of that stretching and shrinking process, and the faster you progress to maturation. So that's another tip for you. If you're somebody who is trying to hasten the maturation of your hair, washing is your friend in that regard. However, if you opted for a quicker or cheaper option, which is usually the case with the less stable structures like comb coiling and finger coiling, especially if you're using product, you might not be able to wash as frequently as possible. It really depends. I've had clients who started that way, come for their maintenance every 2 to 3 weeks, and they wash their hair. The only thing, of course, is that in the initial stages, if you started with comb coils, when you wash your hair, understand that a vast majority of your coils or your starter locks are going to come out. That's absolutely normal. You're just going to have to, you know, if they come out completely, you reinstall them. If they come out partially, you reinforce. Pretty soon, because your hair has memory, okay, pretty soon, by the time you do that 4, 5, 6 times, your hair is like, oh, okay, this is a new order, this is the way it's going to be, and they'll settle and stop unraveling. So that is that. I don't advise anybody to avoid water. I've heard people say, you know, that they went for 6 months without washing their hair. And I feel bad for their family members, colleagues, you know, and flatmates who have to live with them, because I'm like, why? Don't do it. Please wash your hair. Okay? Okay? Thank you. All right. Moving right along. So I already talked about what is still commonly known as the ugly stage. I refer to it as the awkward stage. So I'm not going to dwell on that anymore. Short of just giving a few tips. Like I said, some people get through this by, wigging it. So they cornrow their hair and wear a wig all the time or almost all the time, except for when they're getting their hair washed or getting their hair maintained. Other people get through this stage by box braids or Senegalese twists or crochet hairstyles. But and then some other people get through it by becoming very intentional about makeup. They up their makeup game. Some people accessorize it. They try out like statement pieces of jewelry, whatever you need to do to get through this phase. But understand that everybody goes through this phase, and I feel like just knowing that, you know especially for concerned family members and friends who are like, what's going on with your hair? I'm concerned when I get to do your hair. If this is something you already know, you understand that, look, my locks need to, this is normal, my locks need to pass through this phase for me to get where I'm headed, then you're better informed. You're able to talk to these people and like, oh, it's okay. My mental health is perfectly fine. I'm not breaking down. This is entirely normal, and my locks need to pass through this phase to where I'm going to. It's just good to know. So and don't even feel like you need to explain yourself to anybody. You really don't owe anybody an explanation, but I think it really depends on the way the person comes at you. If you know that this person genuinely is asking out of love and concern, and they don't know about locks, then you can explain to them. But you shouldn't feel pressed to explain your hair to anybody. If it's just good information for you to have, so that you know that, oh, your locks are perfectly fine, and this is to be expected. But don't feel pressed to explain your hair to this 2022. So if they can't live with it, they can go and hug a transformer. Okay.